theory has to have a priority.
Capitalism and artificial intelligence are the same thing.
The dimension of the future has disappeared.
There is actually no representation anymore.
There is no final resolution to contradiction.
Militant proletarian snake handling over abysses never gets much wilder than this.
Hey guys, what's going on? Happy Valentine's Day.
Hey there.
What's going on, Nance?
Lady.
So
I'm gonna butter your bread.
Isaac Hayes voice.
Hey there. Welcome to Valentine's Day 2026.
Smooth.
Happy Valentine's Day out there, all you.
You're gonna get them way too excited, Nance.
Yeah, I know. It's exciting. It's fun to do.
So yes, it's Valentine's Day, and we just a little bit ago finished recording a very cool conversation with Peter Rollins about good old Soren Kierkegaard, and primarily about his book Fear and Trembling. And it wasn't until the end of the discussion, after we had stopped recording, that we're like, oh yeah, it's Valentine's Day. We should have mentioned that. So we're doing this little extra intro video to mention the fact that it's Valentine's Day. Hope you guys have a good Valentine's Day. For us, we spent Valentine's Day with the true love of our life. We'll say theory. It might have been funner to just say Soren Kierkegaard, but
Yeah.
no, the three of us got together for this conversation, and at the end of it, Peter talks about how special and unique this conversation about Kierkegaard was, and that there's really nothing like this conversation existing online. And it's because a lot of the people who are interested in Kierkegaard oftentimes are limited to just Kierkegaard, whereas we're going to bring Kierkegaard into discussion with Žižek, Lacan, Levinas, and a whole host of other thinkers. This conversation primarily is, we talk about Levinas, we talk about Lacan and Žižek, Hegel a lot, and especially Žižek's Hegel with this notion of contradiction that Todd McGowan emphasizes. We cover a lot of ground and make a lot of connections in this conversation, and so this is our Valentine's Day, happy Valentine's Day wish to you. Is this conversation?
Yeah. An evening with Soren Kierkegaard.
Yeah, what better book? Isn't that the perfect image for Valentine's Day?
Happy Valentine's Day. Kill your son. Wait, just kidding. Don't. But no, I mean, we were talking, like, I genuinely feel like if you take Kierkegaard and you give him the Levinas update and the Lacan update, you get something that's so rich and so deep and so, I mean, there's so much meaning and so much that you could apply to the world we live in today that's missing. Like it opens up just a richness. And yeah, it's Kierkegaard is huge. And I mean, existentialism. And I even think, there's a pessimist tradition that draws a lot from Kierkegaard. I see a lot of Kierkegaard in someone like Kieran, where there's just kind of absurdity, but nevertheless, you're constantly taking this leap into life, into the absurdity of life. Yeah, don't sleep on Kierkegaard.
No. And so I guess, look, before we get into the conversation with Peter, I just want to take a second, say, look, Kierkegaard, I say this in the conversation with him, Kierkegaard's the first philosopher whose work I really fell in love with. So it's fitting to do this on Valentine's Day. as an homage to somebody who is so important to me. Like, seriously, I would not have become the thinker I am, doing what I'm doing, without Kierkegaard. I very easily might have lost interest in philosophy if I didn't have that early encounter with Kierkegaard's work that truly drew me in to this whole thing called philosophy. And that said, Kierkegaard can be very difficult to read. I mean, he doesn't write like Lacan or Deleuze or Derrida, but he's very difficult to read in his own right. And so for anybody who's watching this who hasn't read any Kierkegaard and maybe is a little bit intimidated to try to go read them on your own, I'm somebody who believes heavily in secondary material. There's people who's like, no, just read the primary sources, tarry with the primary sources. And you know what? If that's the way you approach things, great. It never worked for me. I needed a foothold into the primary sources. And so I read, as you can see the books behind me, I read a lot of secondary material when I was younger. And so I just want to take a moment and say, look, if you want to get into Kierkegaard's work, but the primary texts are intimidating, arguably to me, the best one to start with, Claire Carlisle's Kierkegaard, A Guide for the Perplexed. I mean, it covers all of the basics that you need. I think it's, for me, pound for pound, the best intro to Kierkegaard I can recommend to you. If you want something that focuses exclusively on Fear and Trembling, then John Lippitt, his guide to Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, I put that next on the list. Another really great intro. Peter mentions him in our discussion. John Stephen Evans, Kierkegaard, an introduction. Great intro. And then this one I really liked. I remember it had a big impact on me at the time that I first read it. Kierkegaard, Thinking Christianly in an Existential Mode by Sylvia Walsh. I was just showing Nance this because I know he would be interested. Levinas and Kierkegaard in Dialogue. This is a fun one. This is more advanced as a secondary source. So I don't know if you start with this, but this is definitely a good one. And then if you read a secondary source and then you want to, an intro and then want to go on to something a bit more challenging, but fun, this one that compares and contrasts Kierkegaard and Nietzsche on The Best Way of Life, this one's a lot of fun. Hopefully there's a paperback. This was expensive when I got it, I don't know, 10 years ago or whenever it came out. But yeah, I just want to say, hey, thank you, Kierkegaard. You changed my life, and Fear and Trembling had a lot to do with that. So yeah, any thoughts before we start the interview?
Look at all these bats. It must be bat season.
All right. Well, you redeemed yourself. All right. Just watch the interview. You guys will get the reference, or maybe you won't. Whatever. Happy Valentine's Day, you theory junkies.
With a big smooch. Mwah. Happy Valentine's Day.
Later. All right, everybody. Welcome back to The Dangerous Maybe. And today we are joined by none other than Peter Rollins. And we are gathered here today to get through this thing called Kierkegaard. And we are going to be discussing primarily Fear and Trembling. I'm sure some other Kierkegaardian references and books will probably make their cameos along the way here. But yeah, we are super excited. Fear and Trembling is a book that has had a big influence on me. Kierkegaard was probably he was the first philosopher whose work I truly loved. I had studied philosophers before that, but he's the one, when I read Fear and Trembling, at that point in my life, it was a huge game changer for me. So yeah, we are super thrilled to have Peter here to walk us through this argument and, make some Lacanian connections to it and see where it goes. But before we get into the discussion, Nance, what is up?
What's happening, man? I'm chilling. I had a joke I was going to tell about having a bad dream and not being able to sleep and then waking up and watching Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. And I thought it was going to be clever and tie it all together with the insomnia and the Fear and Loathing. But I'm a bit tired because I didn't sleep well last night. So I don't know if I have the energy to put it together. But yeah, I think this is excellent. I think this is, Mikey, we were talking back and forth. Like there's so much going on, so many questions that I think we can interpret either way. Like, is it psychosis? Is the divine silent psychosis? Like that's a question I kept coming back to. Or is there some kind of perversion? I don't know. I think there's a lot of stuff in this coming back to Kierkegaard. It's just not something I engage with often. Like 20 years ago, it was like, oh, Kierkegaard, he's an important guy. You got to read him. And then going on and on and on and on and on. So coming back to it, I think has raised a lot of interesting questions, far more interesting questions than the ones I was asking 20 years ago when I was kind of getting into it. So I'm excited to get into
Look,
this.
there's a reason that Kierkegaard is often atheist philosophers' favorite Christian philosopher, right? So Peter, like, it is just great to have you here. You know, I know that you have been focused on this book recently, but before we talk about Fear and Trembling, why don't you tell people about your project? Because to us, you're one of these icons of online theory, and you have been doing a very original project for many years now. So why don't you tell people about your work?
Okay, well, and I just want to mention as well, before we went online, I found out Mikey had done a course that I taught on Žižek's Sublime Objective Ideology. And I find this very funny because I listen to you guys as experts in this stuff, and I go like, oh, you were listening to me, but I'm listening to you guys. So it's a very interesting circle because in some respects, I don't see myself as a theorist. I mean, I am, and I'm really interested in theory, but I have a project. And the project is, I call it Church of the Contradiction at the moment. And it's the creation of a type of liturgy. And, it'll definitely connect with some of the themes that we explore here. But in many respects, I'm very drawn to this idea that in order to existentially undergo some of the ideas that we're going to be talking about in Kierkegaard, we need art and music, literature, comedy. We need to create a liturgy, a space that can help us kind of walk into these things because they're so difficult. So Church of the Contradiction is a type of liturgy that I think helps people to tarry with what Kierkegaard would call paradox. I mean, Kierkegaard once said, what's the difference between a thinker and a professor? And he said, take away the paradox and you have a professor. Basically a professor is a thinker without the paradox. And interesting to me is people like you guys and other people like Helen and Alfie and others who are on the outskirts of the academy, we're all very drawn to contradiction. And I think in some respects, it's one of the reasons why I never went into university life. The contradiction that is at the core of Kierkegaard's work and other thinkers is what drives me and drives many of us. And so my work is Church of the Contradiction. It also involves what I call decentering practices and communion. Decentering practices are these practices that destabilize our symbolic frames. And communion is a social bond that is different from community. So a community is a social bond forged on shared beliefs, identities, values, obstacles, and/or enemies. And a communion for me is a social bond where we share lack. We share the universal negativity. So anyway, that's my work in a nutshell.
That's awesome. So yeah, I mean, look, your thinking about Christianity has been inspired by Lacan, by Žižek, by Hegel, and that in and of itself brings you into a unique relationship with Kierkegaard because he's known as this great opponent of Hegel. And before we've never really talked about it in a video, but Todd McGowan and I have talked about the Kierkegaard Hegel thing many times. And it is this living question where I know thinkers, I think Todd's one of them, and you obviously, where both Hegel and Kierkegaard become important to you. And I know they are for me. And the question is, well, how do we how do we reconcile ourselves to that? And so I think part of it is, trying to think through different ways that maybe we can read Kierkegaard, maybe say, well, the problem with Kierkegaard's Hegel is it's not really Hegel. There's a lot of these issues that hopefully we can touch on a little bit today. I think to get into the conversation, maybe the best thing to do is, why don't you kind of give a summary of Fear and Trembling? I know that can be a big task, but basically, what is this book to you, and why do you think it's important? What do you think it has to teach us?
Absolutely. And another thing we chatted about before we went live, it's always good sometimes to go live right from when you turn on the computer, because otherwise you miss lots of interesting
Exactly.
things. But I was saying how, and I think, Mikey was saying how he was really drawn to Kierkegaard early on, the first philosopher that you may have
Yeah.
really genuinely loved.
But it was,
And
I had studied, I was reading Kant, and I was reading Descartes and Plato and some Aristotle and all that, but I was incredibly fascinated by them. But Kierkegaard's work was the first body of work that really captured my imagination. And I at the time I was practicing, working towards being either a Bible teacher or a minister. It didn't go that way, but
Mhm.
He's continued to just constantly be an influence on me. So even in my book, Capital versus Subjectivity, there's still this influence of Kierkegaard in how I think about passion, how I think about the meaningful life. And I guess for me, I don't think Kierkegaard, even though he wouldn't like this, he would reject it. I still think you can be a non-theist and still have his work completely influence how you think about things.
Yeah.
Even though he wouldn't like that much.
Yes. I mean, to be honest, I'd like to look up whether this is true or not, but I would guess you'd be hard pushed to find a theological college that does much with Kierkegaard. I mean, in philosophy, in continental philosophy, you'll find him, a fair amount, but there's not many theologians, and definitely not seminaries, that are doing very much. There's probably the main confessional Christian theistic scholar is probably C. Stephen Evans, who does really interesting work, but I think he tames Kierkegaard. So yeah, I think the true disciples of Kierkegaard are kind of people who aren't theists at all and aren't in confessional Christianity. Then maybe the one exception to that is Karl Barth, the early Karl Barth. He's probably maybe the only theologian who, you can say was Kierkegaardian in his early days. But one of the things about the book, before you even get into the ideas, is perhaps you enjoyed it because there might be a bit of melancholia in you. I think anyone who has a little bit of melancholia, there's something about Kierkegaard that is very profound. So when I first read him, I didn't understand what he was doing, but I got that. I got the night of infinite resignation, this experience of an absolute loss that you live with and what to do with that. Profoundly, I find that a profound question, and that's central to Fear and Trembling. I mean, I think there are philosophers who are hard to read, but maybe their ideas are relatively simple once you get them. They're very logical. Kierkegaard is like a thinker who's very easy to read, but the more you read him, the more he blows your mind, the more difficult it is. And it's so deceptive because, I say, it's actually quite easy to read Kierkegaard, but in many ways, you've got a critique of Hegel in Fear and Trembling. You have a kind of exploration of faith. You have an existential reflection on what it is to be human. And I think you have a really profound look at what melancholia is in terms of more philosophically, but also a precursor to the psychoanalytic understanding of melancholia. And so all of that's going on in Fear and Trembling. The thing maybe that I'll start with this and we can go from there. But the interesting thing, of course, central to Kierkegaard's entire life is the loss of Regine Olsen, his beloved. And for anybody who doesn't know, I'll just tell the story very briefly. Is he was engaged to be married to this woman, but he had a deep darkness. He said, a dark forest broods within me. and he talked about being 1,000 years too old for her. And he just had this deep melancholy, and he broke off the engagement, and he would make himself look really bad to her and to society because he wanted her to look innocent and good. He wanted to take the guilt on for himself. But Regine Olsen remains this figure in her loss, in his life, that marks the deepest parts of his books and potentially is what made him so creative. Because melancholics, in contradistinction to depressives aren't very creative because their desire is minimal, so they often find it hard to get out of bed and do things. Melancholics often are very creative because they're just circling around loss continually and symbolizing it continually. So Kierkegaard only lived for a short time, died in his early 40s, but produced a phenomenal amount of work. And you hear Regine Olsen in so much of it, particularly in Fear and Trembling. And she married, and I've never been to the graveyard where Regine Olsen was buried, but she's buried with her husband. And then Kierkegaard is buried just across from them so that his basically grave can see their grave. So it's like the ultimate cuckolding, right? Which is interesting because I think cuckolding is melancholia, theatrically performed in perversion. But it's because you theatrically perform the loss. The loss is right in front of you. So Kierkegaard is the ultimate cuckold in this sense with this in this graveyard. So basically, in a nutshell, Fear and Trembling is about this idea of his critique is of the systematizers, the Hegelians who want to systematize everything. And as many people know who are listening, Kierkegaard had like 3 stages: the aesthetical stage, the aesthete, the ethical stage, and then the religious stage. And in a nutshell, what Kierkegaard was interested in, and this is the first kind of key point, which I think is fascinating about Kierkegaard and puts him in our orbit, is that he's interested in something that cannot be reasoned, rationalized, put into a system. So his reading of Hegel is the ultimate systematizer. As we know, he can systematize everything and understand everything, and everything is within reason. And Kierkegaard, in this book, brilliantly wants to say, is there something? He doesn't, and of course, because it's Kierkegaard, he doesn't say it. In fact, he didn't even write the book. Johannes de Silencio wrote it, right? One of his pseudonyms wrote the book, who confessedly says, I don't have faith. I'm going to look at Abraham and Isaac, but I can't understand it. This story is mental. It's madness, but I find it fascinating. It's almost like how you feel when you read Kierkegaard. You're going like, I don't understand it. It's fascinating, but the more I come back to him, the more I can't understand it. And that's Johannes de Silencio's experience with Abraham. And Abraham does this thing, which is totally, obviously mental, right? He goes to kill his kid. And before we get to that, the Kierkegaardian idea here is, yes, something that, oh yes, the religious, right? Religious in the aesthetic might be like doing psychedelics, right? You go, oh, I feel one with everything. There's a beautiful experience, and there's the aesthetic experience. That's wonderful. The height of Hegelian, the ethical stage would be the religious experience. There is loving your neighbor, being good to people, being a good citizen, right? Liberal Protestantism. So if the archetypal religious person in the aesthetic stage is the LA hippie, dropping ayahuasca and being one with everything, then the ethical religious experience is the person who loves their neighbor, cares for the other, is ethical. That's the highest. So liberal Protestantism is kind of the epoch there. But Kierkegaard then says, it goes like, is there something else? He says, is there a stage in which we are called to lose that which gives us ultimate purpose and meaning, an absolute renunciation, an absolute loss? And that's the first moment. That's the Night of Infinite Resignation, which I think is a great name for a band, if anyone had a band, the Knights of Infinite Resignation. So the Night of Infinite Resignation gives up absolutely what is their ultimate treasure, which obviously for Abraham and Isaac is Isaac. And then the knight of faith is the one who paradoxically believes through the absurd, not for any rational reason, that what they have lost will return to them. And so the whole core of the book is this movement. And he says, by human strength, we can be a knight of infinite resignation. And we could say Kierkegaard is this. He lost Regine Olsen. He gave up Regine Olsen, his treasure, what gave him meaning and purpose. But he sometimes would kind of, the hint is, but he could never become a knight of faith who would believe that Regine Olsen will return to him, that he will find, this is the complicated thing, whether it has to be the return of the same or not, but whether something returns that means that you can live, you can enjoy life in the midst of the loss without despairing. Does that give a little bit of a background to the book?
Yeah,
Do you want to
I think
jump
that's
in
really
and do that?
helpful. Yeah, I mean, this whole question of loss and lack, I mean, it's so important for all of us coming from the Lacanian perspective. And
Yes.
obviously, lack is at play in this book. But yeah, it's trying to think through, how does Kierkegaard think of lack? I mean, look, I think about a work like The Sickness Unto Death, where the very famous beginning of the self is a relation that relates itself to itself, and it's relating to itself, this kind of thing. But
Isn't that kind of basically a parody of Hegel, kind of what he's doing
he's
there?
mocking Hegel.
Yes.
But he's also, it's not just I mean, it's two birds, one stone. So it's mocking
Yeah.
Hegel, but he's talking about how the self comes to enter into this harmonious, authentic relationship with God, which in that presentation seems like a plenitude. And so, yeah, because he wasn't a theorist of lack the way that Lacan and Žižek and McGowan are, right? So it was operating in the background. He had a sense of it. But yeah, I mean, you talking about melancholia, you're reading Fear and Trembling in terms of objet petit a. I think all of these, kind of have a major insight to give us in how to read Kierkegaard in a way that resonates with us.
Yes, because my challenge is, one, I want to be faithful to Kierkegaard first. I want to understand him, and that's why I love how you opened this, going like, before we get into other stuff, let's try to just understand the book, what Kierkegaard is doing, and yet he has such rich concepts and ideas that reading people like reading certain concepts like lost object, objet petit a, back into Kierkegaard might allow us to clarify certain things that are there without domesticating them. Because Kierkegaard is like, the reason why he never wants to be studied in university is because he doesn't want to be domesticated. And this is what I think someone like Evans does. He's a much better scholar, of course, of Kierkegaard than me. He's a great scholar. But when I read his way of trying to make sense of Fear and Trembling, there is an attempt to try to go, well, you shouldn't murder your kid. Now, of course, you shouldn't murder your kid, but how
Get right
do
out
we...
of town.
Yes. But like, Kierkegaard wants us to wrestle with the craziness of the story without kind of immediately reweaving it back into the ethical. And it's genius because, I mean, how the book is so good, because that's a story that gives birth basically to the three major monotheistic religions. I mean, it's Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. It is the story that supposedly defines what faith is. We've heard it so many times that we don't hear it in its foreignness. And half of the book, Kierkegaard just basically tells it and retells it in ways that are designed to make you go, this story is monstrous and weird, and I can't understand it. So he takes so many pains to go, if anyone just preaches this from the pulpit and doesn't feel the fear, and it's almost like the fear and trembling of the title is not so much what Abraham felt, it's what we should feel when we read the story of Abraham and Isaac. That's the fear and trembling. We should be like, what do we do with this story? And is he a monster? Is he having, as Nance said, a psychotic break? Is it ethical? Is there, because at the time there were child sacrifices, and there's a way of, I suppose the main scholarly way of reading the story is to say that, and I think this is probably the correct scholarly way. It's the philosophically wrong way, but the correct philosophical way is going like, well, the people who worship Baal, they sacrifice their kids. So
Yeah.
they were like going to the Jews, hey, we love our God so much, we'll even kill our kids. And so here's a story where you go, well, hey, hold on a second. You know, the father of our faith, he loved God so much he was going to kill his own kid, and then God said not to. So, you know, so there you go. We would kill our kids as well, but God doesn't want us to. So, but Kierkegaard wants to avoid that because that's rendering the story tame and domesticated. So he wants us to feel the horror of it. I can't remember why I was saying that, but
No, if you read Kierkegaard in banality, you're not reading Kierkegaard.
yes, yeah, you're not. You're not. There's a fundamentally, if it's not disturbing, it's not Kierkegaard. And the thing that we haven't touched on yet, I should have mentioned it at the beginning, is he didn't write the book. I mean, he wrote the book, but he wrote it under one of his pseudonyms, John the Silent One, Johannes de Silentio, and it's it's written from the perspective of someone who doesn't have faith. So it's written from the outside perspective of someone in fear and trembling going, what is this story? And there's no easy answer in it. And on the same day, this is also so genius of Kierkegaard. I wanted to do a similar thing when I was younger. He published another book on the same day, 16th of October, 1843. He comes out with Fear and Trembling and Repetition. And Repetition's written by another pseudonymous author, Constantinius. And it's about the same kind of stuff. But it's also completely kind of contrasting and different. And so he's doing such creative things that you're almost going like, what does Kierkegaard think? You know,
Right,
he
yeah.
leaves us with this horror. Here's how I think God features, and I've struggled with how Kierkegaard thinks about God, but in these books or in Fear and Trembling, I see God as like analogous to a black hole. You've got the four spatial dimensions, space and time, and then you have a black hole that is just no information can escape from. In some respects, I read Fear and Trembling as him saying that there exists or there insists a absolute otherness that the Hegelian system can't systematize, and we tarry with that absolute negativity and
Kind
that
of like,
absolute negativity of God.
can you see a correspondence there between Levinas and what he thinks about totality and infinity, where there's a totalizing system, but the infinity of the other is what escapes it. And so for Kierkegaard, that infinity would just be God, but for Levinas, he sees this infinity as present in all human beings.
100%, 100%. And I guess that's why that's why I don't think there's any Kierkegaardians around, not many, because in one sense, I think that this absolute otherness is theorized, you know, subsequently by other thinkers, you know, and you've got it like Das Ding. I think, you know, this Freudian notion of Das Ding functions in the same kind of way as that
Yeah.
infinity and totality and infinity.
Richard
And
Boothby's done a
Derrida
lot of
plays
great
with
work
it.
on that.
Who has, sorry?
Richard Boothby.
Oh yeah, oh Boothby's amazing, and
Yeah.
also such a beautiful guy as well, but a brilliant thinker. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, yeah, there's so many directions I want to go in right now. You know what? Let's do a little bit more on the text itself, and then we'll go into some of these other questions. So, for somebody who's not familiar with the book, I just want to give them a rundown of the basic structure. So, the book consists of a preface, an attunement or a tuning up, and then a speech in praise of Abraham. Those are all kind of leading up to the main body of the text. And then there's a preamble from the heart. And then the main text is Problema 1, Problema 2, Problema 3. And then there's a short epilogue. And so some of them, we'll just touch on the more interesting ones for a second. Looking at this. So this part called the attunement or the tuning up, he offers 4 alternative Abrahams. Like, okay, what if Abraham, what was going on in his head? What are different existential responses to this? And so, like, for example, the first one is the precautionary Abraham. The second one is what I call the resentful Abraham, then the ethical Abraham, and then the doubtful Abraham. And we don't have to go into like all of that, but it's important. Like Kierkegaard's fully aware, like, you know, most people would not respond to this the way Abraham did. There's these more understandable responses. You know, oh, you're bitter towards God because he even asked you to do this. You're doubtful that God is even like God wouldn't ask me to do this. This isn't really God. There's like the precautionary one that's you're just pragmatic. Like, wait, how does this? I'm supposed to, give birth to a nation. There's these different responses, and so yeah, and then in the midst of all this, uh, each one of these at the end includes like a thing about a mother weaning her child. So could you say something about these four Abrahams and then the breast weaning thing?
Yeah, I find the breast weaning thing very fascinating because, as you're mentioning for the viewers, is at the end of these different readings, it's just this little parabolic little reflection on different ways to wean a child. And it almost feels so out of place in some respects. So we'll come back to that in a second. But yeah, the different readings, what I find about Kierkegaard is he's almost like closing the doors for all the ways out of trying to make Abraham understandable. Like he wants to make Abraham as enigmatic as possible. So all of the things that, okay, this, you could tell that he would be, as you say, doubtful, or he'd be resentful, or he would carry it out and would be very unhappy for the rest of his life. All of these are very understandable. And it's almost like he's going, yeah, but this is not Abraham. So each story is a failure. It's almost like this, it's like very apophatic in its style. Instead of kind of say what God is, it keeps going like every time you try to describe God as a failure. And it's similar, I think, structurally with going like, here's a way to describe what Abraham did. Oh, and it's not right. And here's a way, it's not it. And not almost even saying maybe one of these readings is right. But if it is right, then there's no such thing as faith. It's like Abraham describes something that just cannot be domesticated in our normal sense of things. And the coming back then to the weaning, the way I think about it, I think about it in different ways at different times, but is that so the three examples, I think there's three. He says one is a mother will wean her child sometimes by, he says, blackening her breast to make it revolting for the child. So the child does not want to eat of the breast. The second, the mother withdraws the breast, just makes it unavailable. And then that's another way to wean. And then the third is the mother takes away the breast, but, brings other sustenance to the child. And I guess in some ways, it's almost like saying the last one might be a hint to what the night of faith is. So one is the blackened breast, the kid's revolted and angry, and it's very aggressive. The second is very melancholic and just this lost object that can't even be symbolized, it's just taken away. And the third is interestingly, there is a loss, there is a fundamental renunciation, but there is sustenance to come. And his two major figures in this book, as I mentioned, is the night of faith and the night of infinite resignation. And there's lots of people before the night of faith, people who don't renounce, people who try not to, people who are optimistic, people who, are part of the crowd, the public, who, but if you get to this point, oh, and by the way, it's not even, Abraham chooses to kill Isaac because he hears God say it. But he uses another example of a young man who falls in love, I think, with a princess. And she doesn't love him back because he's just a lowly guy. So his renunciation wasn't chosen. It was kind of happened to him. But for Kierkegaard, I think that's just as valid. But still, because whether the renunciation is something that you do, or whether the renunciation, or whether the loss is something you do, or the loss is something that happens to you, renunciation is the act of will. It's the highest kind of act that you can do to embrace that renunciation. somehow let it go. But it's not quite the night of faith. That's not Abraham. So all of this attunement is all about going, it's not this, it's not this, it's not this. And then you think in the second half, it's going to be, okay, now we're going to find out what it is. But it's the problemas, the three problemas, which is there a teleological suspension of the ethical? I think, is there an ultimate duty to God? And can we speak this duty? They're not problems, they're problemas. They're designed not to give you a solution, but almost to intensify the paradox and the tension. So.
That's great. I mean, look, I think that gets us, into the book good enough to kind of start talking about some other questions related to it. Because, Nance, what are you thinking? I know you've been thinking about this a lot the last few days.
I think for me, there's still a nasty little atheist alive in me that I just always get, I don't know, nervous when we start talking about God and God in this positive presence. But I think Kierkegaard is a really deft way at showing, like, moving from loss to lack, like, because faith is this thing that can't be universalized, can't be languaged, can't be explained. Like, you can only show it in its absence, so it's only present in its absence. I do think it's an excellent way to talk about lack. But there's still a part of me that says, well, I think we should have fanatical faith. I do think we should have the faith of the fanatic, the faith that can't be explained and can't be, you look mad, and just put it in the other, or put it in the world, as opposed to raising it up to God. So, even for me, reading Kierkegaard is contradictory. Like, it's full of tension. There's so much there that I love. But there's a huge part of me that's just like, I'm being taken somewhere that I don't necessarily, I wouldn't profess to be wanting to go to, but it turns out I'm perfectly comfortable here.
Yes. No, that's exactly my frustration and difficulty. A wonderful frustration, like profound frustration, because it creates something. This notion of God in the text. And yes, there was something I was going to say about that. What Derrida does with this is interesting, because, there is a way of, like, Derrida almost says that, and this is very Sartrean, actually. Jean-Paul Sartre in Existentialism and Humanism gives the example famously of a young man who goes, should I fight the Nazis, or should I look after my mother? In other words, should I be a very small part of something very big, or should I be a very big part of something very small? And, Sartre's whole point is, there's no way to decide. There's no ethical, he goes to a university professor to try to get advice. And Sartre's saying, like, we do that. We go to tarot cards and tea leaves and the Bible and professors. We want to, we want to get rid of, we want to avoid our freedom. But there's something in which you just have to act. Even at the core of the ethical, there is a non-rational, fanatical commitment that one must take, and that is ungrounded. And so, in some ways, for me, that is what Kierkegaard has with God. But I do find that when this absolute otherness is theorized in people like Derrida and Levinas and Lacan, I find it easier. And maybe for that reason, I should resist it. Oh, by the way, I'm a big God guy. Anyway, God, I'm doing Church of the Contradiction. So in some respects, now I'm doing a different thing with God. My notion is the absolute is divided, that it's actually really good to have the idea of an absolute that is full of alienation. And so in some respects, I do want to have a place for the signifier God in some way. Don't know whether we want to talk about that or not, but anyway, I just echoing.
No, I do. I think we do want to talk. So look, here's my question to you: is this a moment where you stand back? I can't help but read Kierkegaard as, I think he holds something like a Christian fundamentalist theology. Now, I know people will go, it's more of this Lutheran, but he is such a Bible believing Christian. Like, and I say
Yes.
that, having grown up with that, that's why, like, the two types of people I know who love Kierkegaard are existentialist intellectuals and Christian fundamentalists. If you're in Kansas City and you hang out at a Bible, or you hang out at a coffee shop that has regular Bible studies, sooner or later somebody's going to be in there with Kierkegaard, and they're his favorite philosopher. Because,
Oh,
go ahead.
no, no, no. You just reminded me. Who said this? I don't know who said this. I think they said it in relation to Kierkegaard. It must have been a podcast I listened to, so this isn't my insight. But they said, like, there's some meme that has a bell curve, and it's a bell curve where you have absolute idiots on one side and like experts on the other. And in the middle, you have like kind of the thoughtful people. And so, for example, you go like, an idiot thinks if I just lift heavier weights, I'll get fitter. The people in the middle have got like, I've got scientifically approved diets, and I do all this. And then the experts go, you lift heavier weights, you're going to get fitter. I use that example because I got a friend, Michelle. She's a fitness person. She goes, yeah, lift heavier weights. But somebody said, yeah, with Kierkegaard, it's like you've either got, yeah, it's just faith and you just kind of like fanatically embrace. And then you've got the middle, which is all very thoughtful. And then you've got the true Kierkegaardian, who's just seems to be saying the same thing as the fundamentalist. And
Yeah.
the two ends of the bell curve seem to somehow meet. And that's
Yeah.
interesting.
But no, it's funny. Like, a lot of theologians I've talked to, they have all these theological problems with Kierkegaard and all that. But just your average card carrying Baptist, he's the one philosopher, because they typically are completely suspicious of philosophy. But they're like, no, this one guy was a philosopher for us. And it's funny. Like, so you have atheist existentialist intellectuals who love him, and then you have, hardcore Christian fundamentalists who love him. And
But is that the case? Because right, I believe you, and you would know better than me. But right, my intuition would have been, although the bell curve would fit with what you're saying, but my intuition would have been that they don't like him, and I'm trying to think why. I mean, partly because I think fundamentalists are so into reason. Like, so for example, creationism it kind of employs the scientific method in form, and yet comes to different kind of content. So I often think of fundamentalists as weirdly having a very scientific kind of way
that's a
of seeing,
good
like they
point.
reduce the, yeah. So the irrationality of Kierkegaard, I would have thought they
So here's what's
would
weird though,
not
Peter.
like.
So the Christians, because at both the coffee shops I go to, they're different in orientation, but there's always Bible studies going on. And I've had these discussions. And again, my frame of reference is, Midwestern, American, Christianity. Hold on. The camera
AI
does this auto AI thing. I have got an AI camera, and if I hold my hand up in a certain way, it starts doing the AI thing and following me around. Okay, so at least in America, in the Midwest, there's almost like two types of fundamentalists. You have the ones who love William Lane Craig, who, everything in the Bible can be rationally explained and rationally defended. But then you have the fundamentalists who love Kierkegaard precisely because he puts the emphasis on faith. And they think that trying to do this thing of, I can go through and defend every claim in the Bible scientifically and rationally, they don't even go for that. They think it misses the true calling of the Christian, which is faith. And so I see them split down that line.
That's very interesting. And because I don't know if you can tell me like who their heroes are, because it's very easy to name the fundamentalist heroes that are rationalists, even people like Ken Ham, and as you say, William Lane Craig, and these thinkers who, in one sense, yes, like it's almost like the two extremes of there's it's classical atheist, which is I don't believe because it's absurd. Then there's the kind of evangelical, let's say, says I believe because it's not absurd. And then you have the weird kind of like Tertullian Kierkegaardian idea, which is I believe because it's absurd. And
Right.
but when you say that, it does make sense that some fundamentalists, they're the ones I'd have more hope for. Is the funny thing. They're the ones, and probably I was that, to be honest. So maybe that's why. But do you have any examples of like of who they're kind of conceptual heroes are? Is
I
there
mean,
like a
yeah, I
William
think
Lane
William
Craig?
Lane Craig is kind of the main hero for that type of Christian fundamentalist. I mean, because he's had
Or the
so many
rational?
debates. Yeah, like the
Yeah.
rationalist type
What
that
about the other one? But what about the other one?
I mean, as far as I know, it'd be Kierkegaard. As far as like the Christian fundamentalist who
Yeah.
wants to emphasize faith, that's why they like him so much.
But is there any contemporary? Because this is where I'm thinking is like I don't know if there's a contemporary fundamentalist Kierkegaardian
No, like a
thought.
figurehead. No,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
no. And so I think now here's the funny thing. I do think there's a bit of like enjoyment in transgression here with Kierkegaard for them because they identify, oh, he's really a Christian, but it's inherent transgression because it's going against, oh, we have to like literally scientifically prove Noah's Ark. And, they're sitting there going, I don't feel like that is anything I need to be doing as a Christian. And they see this strong radical emphasis on faith and
Mhm.
a life based on that. They think that's the real Christian mission, not trying to, can I scientifically prove Genesis 1? Can I scientifically prove Noah's Ark? Can I? And they're just going, it doesn't matter. But that's why William Lane Craig, I've heard him say he doesn't like Kierkegaard.
Oh yeah, I'm sure he wouldn't. And that's where I would go. Like my intuition would be like the dominant fundamentalist sect group wouldn't like him only because the dominant group seems to be very in love with rationality. And secretly, I know a lot of this because I love following that kind of stuff on YouTube. I love nothing more than watching Ken Ham talk about creationism. But you're in a place where you see it. The only thing I'm thinking is those kids who are reading Kierkegaard in that fundamentalist world, I do go like, actually, that gives me hope that I wonder if you can stay there or if you really stick with Kierkegaard, he's gonna mess up that fun. Because even though he's so fanatical, like Nance was saying, there's also something so subjective about it that 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 really undermines fundamentalism. Like
Yeah.
his truth is subjective is so kind of um so difficult to reconcile with fundamentalism.
So one of the things that I find though is that okay, they also love him though because he's more fundamentalist, and I'll explain what I mean by that. He's more literalist
Yeah.
than so many contemporary theologians. Like he really does believe Jesus walked the earth, that he died on the cross, that Jesus is the one true God. Like, and so this thing that I would be tempted to do, which is look, I think Slavoj does this in Enjoy Your Symptom. He says, look, Kierkegaard's aesthetic, ethical, and religious map onto the imaginary, symbolic, and the real. And I love this idea of taking what Kierkegaard calls the religious sphere, and he connects it always to passion, and just thinking of these different modes of life as culminating in the passionate life. But I don't think you have to have God to have the passionate life. And that's where Kierkegaard and the Christians I know who like him would go, no, you can't secularize, you can't atheize
Yes.
Kierkegaard's religious sphere. But you even see theologians who, in some way, go in this direction, like Paul Tillich, where faith is ultimate concern. And so, how do you feel about it? Because I feel like this is where the difference is with you and Kierkegaard. You want to emphasize, a la Hegel and Žižek and Lacan, that God is split, divided. Isn't God still kind of a substantial figure for Kierkegaard? Even if it's a black hole, it's still a substantial black hole.
Yeah. Well, so here's the thing. I would love to hear what you guys think of this because is it the case that we can historicize this? Like, is it the case? And thankfully, this is less important than the work. But is it the case that this notion arises out of Christianity? Like that. So the kind of primary definition of God that you get in Christianity with Anselm is basically God is a signifier that names something that cannot be signified. I mean, that's in the proslogion. He doesn't obviously say it like that and put it in the psychoanalysis, but he does say the God is names what is beyond conception. So we have a signifier for something that cannot be signified. Now, if in Christianity and in theology, so my primary degree is actually scholastic philosophy. Interesting. So, if the argument would be, and I think potentially you guys fit in this. I think Žižek does, because obviously Žižek calls himself a Christian atheist. There's obviously people like Ernst Bloch and Lacan and Heidegger who have all said a version, and Simone Weil, of only a Christian can be an atheist, right? They've all said some slightly different version of that. One way of thinking about what does it mean to say only a Christian can be an atheist is potentially saying that it's just purely historically, Christianity is the religion in which this idea of of God as a master signifier, and ultimately God as a divided other, arises. So in one sense, historicizing Kierkegaard, I go, yeah, Kierkegaard is the father of existentialism, because in a way, we get there through this, maybe you can call it a vanishing mediator, God. I mean, God, like, that's why I don't think anyone can be a Kierkegaardian now if they're kind of like within the culture, because, but I do think it's vital. I go, does this not right from the beginning, right from the Apostle Paul, and even earlier than that, but you've got this idea of God not naming a substantive thing. Of course it does, and that's how people think of God. But actually, in sophisticated theology, there has been this constant thing of, even whenever Aquinas, even with Aquinas' 5 ways, at the end of the 5 ways, he says, this is what we call God. Just, it's slightly different from this is God. It's almost like God is the name we give to an uncaused cause, an unmoved mover, almost to the first signifier. The first signifier isn't a signifier until there's a second signifier. So it's almost like, so almost like God is the name of what cannot be named. And hence we needed Kierkegaard in order to get to where we went after him.
But this is where I also see where they come from, where they're like, okay, but this God that can't be named also obviously has some agency and personhood, whatever that means. So now we're already bringing, because if he's saying, hey, I want you to sacrifice your son to me, there's a intelligible dimension to that, even if you're going, but why? But the fact that he can even communicate that at all means like he's operating in the symbolic. And, I mean, like, I don't know what Kierkegaard himself would say about this, but I've always read him as being a literalist. Like, I think in Concept of Anxiety, I think he does believe Adam and Eve were the first 2 people on the planet, and that's literal. I think that all of the stuff about Christ, he believes this is a literal historical figure, God incarnate in the flesh. And because of that, I think the stuff about the great white throne judgment in the book of Revelation, I don't think he would reject that. And so this is where I can't help
He is a troll, but he is a troll. He's hyperbolic. Sometimes I think he wants to believe what the church believes more than the church. Like, and which is always a move that I've talked about this before, is like, often the way to get through confessional Christianity is to go as deep into it as you can. It's so, and the people who I know who come out of it are the ones who threw their record collection into the sea before it was Spotify, who gave all their money up and went to Tajikistan to be a missionary. So I totally agree with you, but there's always this point of Kierkegaard that I think he is almost purposefully trolling, hyperbolic in his language. He's a Nick Ferrante or whatever. He wants to believe the church's doctrine more than the church, almost to ridicule the church for not believing it enough. But so it's almost like both. We said 2 birds, 1 stone. It's like there's sometimes these 2 levels going on in Kierkegaard.
Well, I mean, because what he's rejecting, I mean, Alenka, we just talked to Alenka about her book, Disavowal. I think he feels like that's what Christians in his time were doing. They're disavowing, like, they understand the reality of Christian doctrine. They don't feel the impact of the real of that.
Yeah.
And so there's this disavow. I know very well that God asked me to live my life in full service to him, blah, blah, blah. But nevertheless, I'm going to act as though simply being a member of a church is good enough. Like,
yes.
And so he definitely wanted to attack that.
Yeah. No, 100%. And this is why you're reminding me of an argument I used to make and haven't for a while. This is bringing it all back, but not my argument, but one I'm convinced by. But is that that again, like there's something about, and this is why I was saying that I have hope for those kids in the coffee shop reading Kierkegaard, because I think it's the ones who go so deep in that into the absurd, into the contradiction. The ones who go so deep into that are the ones who arise out of it. Arise in, or, and I have to be careful with my language. I don't think you arise out of it. The ones who go into it, they the confessional doctrinal religion collapses. It doesn't, and it's the one who just sits in the pew and reads the Bible a bit and goes to the sermons and nods their heads. They never leave because they haven't gone all the way in. By the way, this is autobiographical because I was a convert at 17 and I was a fanatical convert and I went so all in. And it was precisely because of that that I discovered, first of all, the mystical tradition, the apophatic tradition, and then moved into kind of the post-structuralist stuff, and then moved into the Lacanian. And people ask me, well, when did you move out of the church? And I kind of go like, it's existentially, it feels like I just kept going deeper in. And I'm not, that's not me being like, it actually just, that's what it feels like. It just feels like I never left. I just went deeper and deeper in. And then I realized that God's an atheist. Like, so, and sometimes I talk about it like a choose your own adventure book that little Johnny's in prayer meeting, should he continue to pray and hope it'll work well? Turn to page 45. Should he walk away, become a new atheist? Turn to page 72, but the answer is almost always is to pick going deeper and deeper and deeper. And eventually, it's like an escape room that you go so deep into, and then you encounter Christ on the cross, who says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And you go, right? The existential atheism is at the heart of Christianity. Now, I don't think Kierkegaard gets, but I think that movement of going in, deeper, the be as literalist as you can is the way to break it. I think that's a logic in Kierkegaard.
I mean, I mean, look, because I think, if we go, what's the core problem Kierkegaard has with Hegel? I mean, yes, it's this idea that he interprets Hegel to be the philosopher of the system that incorporates everything into it, gives it its nice little place, and there's no existential remainder. There's no problem of the groundlessness of human individual freedom. Now, I know Todd would just go, yes, there is in Hegel, right? But Kierkegaard, based on his interpretation, doesn't see it. So the thing though is this moment of Christ on the cross, Father, why have you forsaken me? This is so important for Hegel, for you, for Todd, for Žižek, and what Hegel, the Hegelian takeaway is this is the substantial God dying, in a sense, where he's not radically transcendent outside of the whole. He comes down into the world, he faces mediation, and he's not this substantial figure that people have taken him to be. And so that figure dies, and what emerges out of that is a community based around this loss. And Kierkegaard would say, well, that's just not the absolute paradox that Christ is. And the Kierkegaardian, and so this is where I think the Kierkegaardian and the Christian fundamentalist rebuttal would be similar. Okay, there's an emphasis on him dying on the cross, but the way that the Christians I know read it, and I think Kierkegaard would say, okay, but this is the absolute paradox speaking from the human side. I'm a human. Christ was a human. I'm speaking to God, and I'm experiencing all of the suffering of eternal damnation and judgment. I'm taking all of humanity's punishment onto me, and I'm speaking to God as a human, not as God to God. And so what that is this human dimension in basically suffering hell, saying, I'm in hell because of my sins. Why have you forsaken me? And that it's not like there's no God there. It's that God is the substantial God is ignoring you because of your sin and because you've gone to hell. But then they go, but the thing is, the story goes on. Like, he gets back up 3 days later, and it, and then with the rest of the Bible, the book of Revelation, that substantial God is still there throughout the rest of it. And so, yeah, they would say, like, this is this moment, and it's not God literally dying. It's a human taking on the sins of all humanity, calling out to God from hell. So I just, I see this as this, a difference in interpretation of what happened on the cross.
So 100%. And this is why I have, and only started doing this actually since I reread the book, of wanting to call myself like post-Kierkegaardian, because and in relation to this and then something else in a segment, I think like Kierkegaard, so the logic for me of Kierkegaard, which I said there, is almost like it's so literalistic, like you mentioned, so literalistic. It's so too much. It's so hyperbolic. And that's his approach. And when he reads Abraham and Isaac, he shuts every door. I think that to read the crucifixion in a Kierkegaardian way would be to do the same with the crucifixion. To read it in a Žižekian way is to not have like a back door where you go, oh, well, it's not really God, like the Orthodox thing. Well, it's the human suffering and there's a God behind the scenes. I totally agree with you that that's not in Kierkegaard, but this is where I think Kierkegaard, and I hate to say this because I think Kierkegaard is obviously is a genius and so much more, but you can't do everything. And I think this is where Kierkegaard isn't Kierkegaardian enough. I mean, he didn't write a book on the crucifixion. Maybe if he did, he would have done it. But I think if Kierkegaard did with the crucifixion what he did with the Abraham and Isaac, it would be a Žižekian reading. But you're absolutely right that that's not what Kierkegaard did. Kierkegaard has, I don't know if he even says this, but basically somewhere, if I recall, that it's like we don't have the blueprint, but God does. Like that's the difference. The difference is at one point, Kierkegaard, I think, goes against his own radicality by saying, okay, the paradox is here, but it's not up there. And in fact, that's how I define the difference between paradox and contradiction. I think paradox ultimately is always it's irreconcilable for us, but it's not irreconcilable in the absolute. Whereas contradiction is, of course, the contradiction is woven into everything. So I totally agree with you. And this is why I call myself post-Kierkegaardian, because I don't think I'm anti-Kierkegaardian, because I think I'm taking the logic of Kierkegaard and I'm applying it. The other area that I do a post-Kierkegaardian thing is Kierkegaard says the night of infinite resignation absolutely gives up the, say, objet putia, the thing that gives our life meaning and purpose. And then the night of faith kind of believes that it will return. But again, I think here's the Žižekian reading of this, I think, and this is central to the work of the Church of the Contradiction, is that the night of infinite resignation doesn't resign absolutely, or there's a double meaning in infinite resignation. So infinite resignation sounds like they give up completely, but they're also infinitely tied to resignation. And that's why I think Kierkegaard is melancholic, right? So the melancholic is the one who is too close to the lost object. The depressed person loses the object and they're really sad about it and they drink a lot of alcohol and they do things to numb the pain of the lost object. But the melancholic is too attached to the lost object and remains too attached to the lost object. So for me, the night of infinite resignation actually remains so tied to the lost object that they become a poet, that they become like they make it infinite and transcendental. And then the night of faith for me is the one who redoubles the renunciation. They don't get something back, but they give up the giving up. They lose the lost object. That for me is the night of faith. This is not a Kierkegaardian reading because he has a stance for God, but in Church of the Contradiction, you have a God who experiences the lost object as well. So the emancipatory movement in church, confessional church, is I have lost the object, God will give it back. The emancipatory movement in something like Church of the Contradiction is I have lost the object, God has also lost the object, and so now I can lose the loss as well. That for me is not what Kierkegaard says, but I think it's true to the logic of Kierkegaard, and so therefore I'm post-Kierkegaardian. Yeah.
All right, that's really great. I mean, look, there's with him, it's also interesting. Like, okay, like I said, when I read Concept of Anxiety, I feel like Adam and Eve are literal figures for him. When he's talking about Abraham, I think he feels like this happened in history. If we had a time machine, we could go back to where this occurred. I think he believes Christ literally was here as a figure who died on the cross for the sins of humanity. But it is odd as a Christian philosopher, though, what he doesn't seem to discuss about Christianity. I don't see him ever talking about hell. I mean, do you think he believed in a literal hell? Or do you think, I mean, because here's the thing, there's almost two questions. Do you hope that he believed in a literal hell, or do you think he did, but probably, I mean, where are you at with that?
Yeah, well, and here's the thing about the literalism. So the way I understand that is it's exactly the same as a psychoanalyst with a dream. So when you tell a psychoanalyst your dream, they don't ask, oh, say I had a dream and I was chasing a bus and I couldn't get the bus while my child was in the bus and I was trying to get to work or whatever, right? They don't go, oh, well, did you see a bus? And were you talking to your? They take the dream literally, absolutely literally, and then that allows for interpretation. So it's not, again, that I'm not saying that he doesn't believe literally in Adam and Eve, but I kind of see him as treating these stories the way a psychoanalyst treats a dream. And my issue, or his issue, I think, with liberal Christianity is liberal Christianity would be like someone on a Joe Rogan podcast as like an evolutionary psychologist saying, oh, well, the dream is because there's certain kind of chemical reactions and you're taken up there. They're going, no, you take the dream absolutely seriously. So in some ways, it's that his critique, I think, of liberalism doesn't, it's a literalism that doesn't demand historicism. That's how I read it.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And then in terms of the hell question, I think he'd do the same kind of thing. But it's, for me, it's that. And that's why I critique scholarship. Well, that's actually Kierkegaard hated scholarship. And that's why I dislike biblical scholarship. I mean, he beautifully said one time that a scholar is like, you have this piece of music and the musical professor can tell you everything about the history of the music and how every bit is composed or whatever. But the music lover doesn't know any of that stuff, but they love the music. They're changed by the music. And, so obviously Kierkegaard hated the scholar because he's going like, Christianity is not some
Didn't he call it something like double assimilation, where it's like, okay, you can learning for him has two steps, but a lot of people leave it at the first. So you learn something academically or intellectually, but you don't learn it in the sense of how it incorporates itself into your life, how you learn it at the cognitive, but then you live it. And
Yes.
he thinks that so much, I think this is his issue with Hegelian philosophers, is they learn all these things about logic and reason and history and all this, but it doesn't find its way into their life. And that's where you can say he's the father of existentialism, because he's saying, if you're not living your belief system, you haven't really learned it.
Yes, and he hates mediation. I mean, his real hatred of Hegel is the middle term. So actually, just this is useful for me to think this through. Is whenever he believes in Adam and Eve, how would Kierkegaard believe in Adam and Eve? Well, he would reject believing in Adam and Eve because it's historical, or using it as a metaphor, because both of those would be mediating. Both of those would be giving a because. He would just believe it. And again, this is why I come back to the psychoanalyst with the dream. It's like, I think Kierkegaard would, if he was here today, he would go, I absolutely believe in Adam and Eve. But if you try to pin him down to either the fundamentalist who says it was an historical happening, or the liberal Protestant who wants to kind of give a metaphorical reading, I think he would genuinely reject both of those.
Okay.
Which is absurd, but brilliantly absurd.
Right. Okay, so Nance and I, we want to ask you this Lacanian question, but I think before we get to that, I'm just going to do a quick thing. So these problemas, no problema, okay, so the first one is there a teleological suspension of the ethical? The second one is there an absolute duty to God? And the third one is, was it ethically defensible of Abraham to conceal his undertaking from Sarah, from Eleazar, from Isaac? So look, I want to spend a little bit of time on each of these before I ask the real question. But is there a teleological suspension of the ethical? Is he not saying, is it not the case that sometimes there's a higher purpose and you have to put the ethical on hold for this higher purpose, which he would say is God? The typical response to this opens up legitimizing terrible acts of violence because, for example, somebody who blows up an abortion clinic, this is one of these famous Christian responses I've heard to this, where it's like, no, you, by validating this teleological suspension of the ethical, you're opening up justification for terrible acts that are unethical. How do you think Kierkegaard would respond to that?
So I think he bites the bullet, but I think he has a potentially good way out of this, because his response would be, you arrest the person. If they say it, you arrest. Like, they're not outside the ethical in terms of civilization. So if someone does something like they want to murder their kid or do anything like that, if that is heard, and if that is that 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 has to be dealt with within the ethical. The thing that he just keeps open is, but we can't say whether that person, whenever, now it can be anything, but whenever a person acts in a way that is absolutely non-rational, they have this absolute commitment to something that is enacted within civilization. And so the ethical, as I say, they will have to be put in prison if they're doing something unethical. I think Kierkegaard just wants to say, but if you shut down the possibility that there is something that is that fractures or fragments the symbolic order. If you don't, you either think there is, and then yeah, there's going to be people who do mad things, but still arrest them and put them in prison, or you don't. You think the highest is ethical, and therefore, just be ethical, be good. There's no higher cause. Doing the good is worshiping God. That's it. But I think what Kierkegaard wants to say is, but you can't have your cake and eat it. If there's a
You can't
rupture
hold
in the
Abraham up
symbolic,
as this hero of faith if that's the case.
yes, and also you have to simultaneously go, Abraham might have been a monster. Um, I almost think, actually, what I love about the story of Abraham for Kierkegaard is it's almost like, it's brilliant. It's like the three big readings of religion are, so one is, let's say, a functionalist reading. Oh, religion is a useful thing and it brings coalesces ethics. In fact, it's a way to make people ethical. So one of the, Robert Spolsky is his name, or I forget. He's
Sapolsky.
Sapolsky, yeah, really interesting and really terrible thinker, but interesting in some way. He would say basically, I don't know if it is, he might not say it as good as this, but I've heard it better said by other people. But if a way to get people to be ethical, the vanishing mediator is religion. You say, well, just like you say to a kid, be nice to your brother, or you'll be sent to bed. Eventually, you want them to embrace ethics. And whenever they can embrace just being nice to their brother because it's the right thing to do, and the golden rule, and they become a Kantian, then you don't need God anymore. So there's that reading of religion, and you can read Abraham as that, which is what we did earlier there. It's like, you know what? It's a story that tells us actually not to kill our kids. The other one is, this is what Robert's position is, sorry. His position is religion arises out of a madness. There is religion arises as a form of psychosis, but also as a way to control psychosis, to give psychotics a place, and to kind of like somehow kind of contain psychotic madness, right? There's that position. Or religion is a direct tarrying with that which is otherwise than being, that is a tarrying with the real. So you've got all three readings of those in Abraham's story. And I think Kierkegaard is partly saying, you can't decide which one's which.
Yeah. I mean, okay, so look, this concept of the ethical that he's operating with, I feel like this is another instance of two birds, one stone. At the time that he's, developing as a philosopher, the two main ethical theories for him it was going to be Kant's ethical theory and Hegel's. And the difference, more or less, Kant does this really formalistic type of ethics with the categorical imperative. It's this abstract reasoning that's universalist, and therefore the ethics is the universal. But the German term, if I'm pronouncing it correct, is Moralität, whereas Hegel wants to emphasize the ethical as a universal too, but for him it's Sittlichkeit. It's the ethics of one's communal space. It's the ethics of spirit, right? Which is more of like a cultural, but it's an absolute, it's a universalist ethics, but it's also culturally relative in a sense for him. But it's really just, okay, it's formal ethics of the universal versus cultural traditional ethics of the universal. And I feel like the teleological suspension of the ethical would involve either way, you're putting either of them or both on hold for something higher. But here's the question. What happens if you introduce, because this brings in the second question, is there an absolute duty to God? Does that mean that actually, if you go with divine command theory, is it just putting the ethical on hold for the ethical? Like, there's another way to, I feel like if you go with divine command theory, you neutralize Kierkegaard because it's like, no, it's just all in the ethical.
Yes, you can. And this is because this is a struggle I had as well. Like, this is so close to divine command theory, but I don't think you can read Kierkegaard in that way for exactly that reason. That would be just reweaving the ethical into it. I mean, it is fascinating because confessional Christians get into a whole pile of bother because in the Bible, there's things like slavery, genocide, there's lots of murder. I saw Ben Shapiro was debating somebody recently about this. Oh, it was Alex O'Connor, who's an interesting guy. I have hope for Alex O'Connor. But he Alex was going like, well, Ben, you say you're an ethical objectivist, and murder's wrong and slavery's just wrong. And he said, and you say that I'm the one who says that ethics develops, but look at your Bible. And of course, Ben Shapiro, like, it's really, you can't get around that. Kierkegaard can, because he can bite the bullet. But you say divine command theorists, they basically weave it in a higher ethical theory. Now, you're absolutely right. I totally agree. The problem with the teleological suspension of the ethical is the word teleological, I think. The way I rewrite it, a Lacanian rereading does the real suspend the ethical? I think that's how I can reread the problema one is, does the real suspend the ethical?
Or
And
does
then
the
I think
real
all the
suspend
problems
the symbolic?
Yes, exactly. There, yeah, even more Lacanian there. Does the real suspend, crack, and exist within the cracks of the symbolic? Yeah, that's it. And of course, we have to obviously, Kierkegaard. It's just the same as what Todd McGowan does with Hegel, where he says, well, if Hegel had Freud, some things would be a lot easier. So, Todd's book on Hegel's brilliant, and he says, we kind of retroactively put a few Freudian terms into Hegel, and it clears things up. I think this is what I do with Kierkegaard. I say retroactively, we put in a few Lacanian terms and it clears it up without, and this is the key, without becoming not Kierkegaardian. I think you become post-Kierkegaardian. It's like, you're not doing exactly, but I think you stay within the logic. So the first problema, exactly what you said, does the real suspend the symbolic?
Well, and so here's another twist on this. So, okay, if we go with divine command theory, which is simply whatever God commands is good. Like, no matter what, if God commands it, it's ethically good. But then if you run that through, especially the Kantian ethical matrix of the categorical imperative, it's like, look, can you universally validate or approve a person sacrificing their child? No, because you contradict the whole of all of humanity. If everybody universally performed that act, and how could that possibly be the good of humanity? You run in, like, it is Kant versus God in this sense. And it's hard for me to see how you could ever reconcile them. And then if you bring in the Hegelian thing, well, one's cultural, traditional, embodied spiritual ethics is there to attempt to make life as communal and as good as we can, trying to implement the sacrifice of your own child doesn't fit that either. So even if we go at it just from a pure ethics standpoint, there's going to be this contradiction. Like, so wait, he can command anything and it counts as good? Well, this is where you end up going, no, there is this tension between what we call ethics and then God. And this idea that, and it just gets out of the ethical weight. I mean, we feel it like, no, sorry. Like if you stand in your sense of ethics, God can't do whatever he wants and it gets counted as good. That's why people have a lot of problems with these stories in the Old Testament where God's doing stuff that you don't seem to be able to justify on any ethical basis. And the only way to salvage him is to just go, well, if he commands it, if he does it, he's unknowable and our ways are not his ways. So it's still ethically good. And
Yes.
so,
No, absolutely. Yeah. And for me, you always have, the first time you say something, it has to be said wrong so that you can say it right. For me, this is basically the real cracking the symbolic said first of all in wrong so that it can be said right as a movement. That's the way it is. And it's, as you say, it is a critique of Kant. It is a critique of Hegel because it is, or his reading of Hegel, which might be the right reading of Hegel. I love Todd McGowan's reading of Hegel. I love Zizek's reading of Hegel. But there's people who know their Hegel better than I do who go, the reading's brilliant, but you can also read Hegel as the great
we
totalizer. I mean,
recently
that's when I did.
Oh, sorry. No, we recently
Oh
had
no,
a
jump
great
in.
conversation with Peter Wolfendale, and Hegel's influenced him a lot, but Peter comes at Hegel from the interpretation of Stephen Holgate and Robert Brandom, and he doesn't go for the Žižekian, McGowan, Lacanian type of reading of Hegel. And I've just encountered this online where you have people influenced by Hegel who go, no, Žižek's Hegel is Žižek, not Hegel.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's a big open question, right? And they'll say like, look, Slavoj, what he does is incredible, like as far as how he works out his own thing, but he should just call it his because like they're like, he doesn't even cite Hegel very much. He's not doing exegesis of showing like, here's where Hegel says the thing, right? And so that's how they counter that. And so some of them would just say, no, Kierkegaard's Hegel isn't that far off from Hegel's Hegel.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I am, I think that's a fascinating question that if I had another life, I would maybe dedicate myself to it, but I'm, doing something else. Like John Caputo says the same. John Caputo says, Zizek's Hegel is brilliant. It's fascinating. It's brilliant. But he says, I don't think it's Hegel. He still has the totalizing reading of Hegel. But yeah, so Kierkegaard, in this first problema, that is there a teleological suspension of the ethical? I think it's, as you said, it's a critique of Kantian ethics, but also even more so Hegelian ethics. And it is really not the first, but it's a very powerful reflection on the idea of, is there something otherwise than being that cracks the symbolic?
Yeah. Okay. This third question, I think, gets to what Nance and I really wanted to ask you about. And I think, Nance, everybody emphasizes the first two. I think the third one seems to be more interesting to you. And so, again, he says, was it ethically defensible of Abraham to conceal his undertaking, that is, his undertaking to sacrifice Isaac, from Sarah, Abraham's wife, Isaac's mother, Eleazar, their servant, and Isaac himself? So, is it ethically defensible for him to not inform Isaac's mother, and the servant who is, I mean, we hear servant, we immediately think fucked up power dynamics, but they loved this guy. He was essential to their family dynamic. Is it okay? Can we justify him not telling them what was going on? The question for us is like, okay, so on the one hand, if you can't symbolically articulate what the intention is, what's going on, it seems like you've become somewhat psychotic. Like you're operating in this space that's outside the symbolic, which I don't know. You could say maybe it's the psychotic is just a subject of the real. At the same time, he's making a decision that fundamentally affects every person involved. And it's as if he's a pervert going, I know what's best for you, better than you, what's best for you. So is he psychotic? Is he a pervert? Or should we not think of him or should we think of him in a third different way?
Yes, this is fascinating. And we didn't mention the second problem. So just very quickly, because people know it, but the second one is, do we have a duty to this real? So that if I write the first problem as is there a real that breaks the symbolic? Then the second is, should we give ourselves to this real?
Could we
And then,
also
yes,
say,
and then the
is
third
there an ethical duty out to the real outside of our symbolic duties to the world and everyone else?
Yes, absolutely. Which, by the way, I read as das Ding, that there's an enigmatic signifier in the other that, and do we have so the way I answer this is yes, we do. Not so much we have a duty to it, but yeah, we ultimately revolve around it, et cetera, et cetera. But then, yes, and then the third one, can we speak it? Should we articulate our passion? And I mean, I'm fascinated with psychoanalysis, obviously, like you guys. And I oscillate between whether so there's way you could read. I think he's definitely melancholic. So he's melancholia, but there's psychotic melancholia, perverse melancholia, and neurotic melancholia, and they all look a little bit different. And I do think that like Kierkegaard fits more with either perverse or psychotic melancholia. And I could probably give a case for either of those two. But yes, but in terms of the question of the third, Nance, what was your kind of thought on that? So I can reflect.
I just the fact that it can't be languaged is why he doesn't tell them. It's not because he's guilty or he feels guilty, or it's not because he's I don't know, he's like, God, damn son, you're always pissing me off, stealing my cigarettes and my $5 bills, like it can't be languaged.
That by the way, yeah, no, brilliant. Like, here's the thing, Akira, and this is my problem with which the third problem I think is the hardest. Well, it's the most boring. I find this like so much. Some of his writing sometimes annoys me, but anyway, but it there's something. This is why again he's very melancholic. Is he doesn't want to symbolize the loss. Like he obviously the problem is, yeah, should you speak and can you speak this passion of the real? Can you speak it? But there is like the melancholic who refuses. They go to war and they come back and they don't speak of the horrors that they saw. They refuse to speak. There is a certain sense in which the melancholic holds on to the lost object, and they, in a sense, fall so in love with the lost object, and speaking it would diminish it. It would dissolve it. It would, and so in psychoanalysis for a melancholic, I have suffered from melancholia, so it's precisely an affect that you can't or do want to speak. And in some ways you want to turn the affect into an emotion. In some ways you want to be able to speak it. So out of all of the problems, out of this entire book, this is the one where I might be most critical of Kierkegaard, right? I think I'm true to his logic right the way through. My few thoughts on the third problem is, one is, reading it on a surface level, well, surely Abraham should say, and then fully commit to it, but also allow himself to be arrested by society, right? So he's fully committed to it, and yet because he's in the ethical, if somebody wants to stop him and put him in prison, that's fine. He still is fully committed to it, but he's still in the ethical, even if he is passionately connected to what calls him out of it. But then he wants to avoid that. Kierkegaard wants to say that, I think he wants to say that as soon as you speak it, you diminish it. As soon as you speak it, you kind of find all sorts of psychological ways to avoid your commitment to the real. But I just think he's in love with melancholia. But of course, we have to remember that this whole book is written by somebody who doesn't have faith. But I don't know, but yeah, Kierkegaard does. Yeah, I don't know. Does any of that make sense?
Okay, so here's where we went with this. Because
Yeah.
we were talking about the perversion thing and psychosis, and then when we were talking, it's like this conversation went somewhere. So we started talking, okay, so hysteria, is there a hysterical Abraham where Abraham goes, okay, you're telling me I ought to take the son that you've promised me for like 100 years, which you know, finally Sarah has our son, you know, well past when she's supposed to be able to have a kid. She has the kid miraculously. Now you're telling me I need to sacrifice him. What's going on here? Like, why are you're telling me this, but what do you really want? And Abraham seems to just act like God's demand is God's desire. And the hysteric would go, are you sure this is really what you want? What's going on here? And when we were talking to Nance, I start thinking, I'm like, is this satanic? Is being hysterical the satanic response, which is you're telling me I'm supposed to do this and then I'm this? Why? Like what's going on here? Does hysteria, is that the crack of the satanic rebellion where you're just not operating in accordance with the demand? You doubt it and you question it and you doubt the validity of the person speaking the demand to you. And again, if you just go, nope, demand is all that I focus on, you're substantializing the other. Like, and this is where I'm afraid Kierkegaard is not Rollins enough, not Žižekian enough, where it's like, no, the demand is God. And that's the thing. If God is split, there is this split between demand and desire that applies to him. If he's not split, then the demand is his full desire. And there's no contradiction.
Yeah, absolutely. No, this makes me think, and here's my reason why I think it's perverse, right? So I think Kierkegaard's perverse is that, so one thing is the pervert theatrically enacts the loss. So the very fact of, so in sexuality, they theatrically enact through sexual rituals and theater, baroque practices and rituals. The perverse melancholic anyway will theatrically enact the loss in their sexual kind of rituals. And so in one sense, this book starts with a theatrical reenactment of loss. You know, Abraham going up the mountain, going to kill his kid, I can easily tell you a sexual fantasy to change all of those, and it becomes a sadomasochistic fantasy.
Isaac the fetish.
It's Isaac. Yes, Isaac. Yeah, I'm now.
Here's the thing, because if you're willing to do it, you're filling in the lack in God. Because you want to say, if God commands me to kill my sin, God's lacking. Something's fucked up with God. The only way you can fill in God's lack is to just go along and treat Isaac as the fetish object that fills in the lack.
Yes, completely. By the way, Pascal, I think, is perverse as well. Pascal and Kierkegaard, and I think they're brilliant for it. This really cool stuff comes out of it. But yes, so Kierkegaard, I think, operates with disavowal, not, as you say, not with repression. There's not a, oh, I don't know, I have doubts. I am going to absolutely kill Isaac. Nevertheless, I will receive Isaac back. Like there's it seems like a disavowal is an operation with Kierkegaard's work.
So is the night of faith the night of disavowal?
Yes, yeah, that's exactly it. That's what I think the night of faith is. In Kierkegaard's reading, the reading that I want to do is the double renunciation. So for Kierkegaard, he talks about faith as a double movement, and it is the movement is you absolutely renounce, and yet you absolutely believe you're going to get back. So that's disavowal. I think if you deperversify Kierkegaard, you can make the double movement renunciation and of the lost object, and then renunciation of the loss itself,
which is the hystericized Kierkegaard.
Yes, exactly.
Like
which
that.
I think he was trying to do. I mean, I almost think Kierkegaard is so smart a guy. He's trying to engage in a self-cure, and a philosophical self-cure. He's trying to, we see but Kierkegaard himself says that he was the night of infinite resignation. Like he never got to the night of faith, but there's something about, I think he wanted to neuroticize his melancholia, and maybe he did actually. I don't know. Who knows?
I mean, look,
but he did, as I say, he is buried in a cuckolding way, so that makes me think he never did.
So here's the thing.
Cure.
Like with the Hegelian, the Lacanian, the Žižekian influence on how you think about Christianity, one thing is none of you guys typically mention Lucifer, and so I'm interested. I mean, when you think about this, even if you just say a character, right? Is there a certain way where Lacanianism opens up like sympathy for the devil? Because what he does in his rebellion is question God's authority. I can't help but see it as a hysterical act. And all of us, in a sense, understand that subjective freedom is rooted in this hysterical dimension. I mean, what do you think of Satan, of Lucifer?
I mean, that is interesting. And Julie Reich has done some stuff on it. She wrote a talk and she gave a talk at actually an event of mine called a satanic something. And and
Is it satanic feminism?
So that's right, satanic feminism,
Yeah.
yes. And she did it partly because she wanted to piss off my people, I think, but they kind of liked it. So, so it is interesting. Like the thing that I really like about that, the idea of a rebellion or fighting against God, is there is, I think, a really good character for that, which is, isn't it Jacob wrestles with God?
Yes.
And then God names him Isaac names him
Israel.
Israel. So thank you, guys. Should know this. Israel, which means to fight and to wrestle with God. Whereas my thoughts on the satanic image. So I've got a couple of thoughts on the satanic image. First is that my reading of the Garden of Eden is that the serpent is the superego conjunction. So that says, so there's basically walking around the garden, everything's good. Then there's a prohibition. And then the prohibition generates this desire. And the serpent is the one who says, eat the fruit and you will be like God, which I read as you will lack. Enjoy, exactly. The superego conjunction to enjoy, to lack the lack, to be like God, to lack the lack. So, and for me, the whole issue with the Garden of Eden is the obedience to the voice, to the superego conjunction to enjoy. I see this as replicated in the Temple of Jerusalem, which you have like a Garden of Eden. You've got the court of Gentiles where everyone can hang out. You have a curtain, and behind the curtain, you've got the Holy of Holies. So you've got like a replaying of the Garden of Eden. You can walk around. There's a prohibition. Behind the prohibition, you've got the fruit that is like the Holy of Holies. And what you have in the Garden of Eden is the superego conjunction to break through the prohibition, enjoy, lack the lack. Whereas the temple curtain rips in the second one, where Christ, at the very moment Christ says, my God, why have you forsaken me? So the very moment that you realize the absolute is divided, the temple curtain rips and you realize there's nothing in there. The nihilistic moment of Christianity, that there's nothing in the Holy of Holies. So the reason why I read the Luciferian image kind of like negatively, and I think I can connect it to the Church of Satan, where one of the rules, Anton LaVey, is do what thy wilt shall be the law. That I see Satanism both in its embryonic form in the Bible, but also in the Satanic Church, as actually a hedonistic superegoic conjunction to enjoy, not the way you're reading it, which I think if you can read it that way, brilliant. But if you read, the serpent in a different way, but I guess my first reading is the superego conjunction to enjoy.
First, I mean, I love that. That's really cool. Okay, so in my book, I guess there's a lot of overlap. There's one point where I actually invoke the, Crowley's "do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law," because I see it as somewhat analogous to "do not give ground relative to your desire."
Oh, that's interesting. Okay,
and that Lacan himself is plugged into this. Now, it's a whole question of how do we want to interpret "do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law"? How do we want to interpret "don't give ground relative to your desire"? But I guess just to bring it back to the Luciferian thing. So look, God, story goes like this. God creates Lucifer. He's the most beautiful creature God creates. He's got more wisdom, all of this. And yet, I mean, there's depictions in the Bible, I think it's in Ezekiel, where, Lucifer would hover above the throne of God as almost like his crowning achievement, right? And the Luciferian act seems to be one of hysterical doubt, which is, you're telling me I'm this is all that I am. You've given me this identity, but what if this is not the identity I want to have? And it seems like Lucifer's the first instance of the friction between symbolic identity and real subjectivity. I'm not reducible to what you have interpolated me to be. And because of that, I've got a problem with that. And yet, so is this the way I'm developing it is, can we view God as prohibiting subjectivity itself. I mean, if you go with this dimension, I love what you just did with the Garden of Eden, by the way, but you could see this thing where it's like, no, you're not allowed to have any subjective surplus beyond the identity that I've interpolated you to be. And that's even with the Garden of Eden. It's like God made them to be so and so. That's it. And then what Lucifer does, if we don't go with the superego thing, what he does is say, you are not reducible to the identity God has given you. There's an excess in you potentially, and it opens the fucking crack between identity and subjectivity in them disobeying the prohibition.
Yeah, well, so maybe this is a way to square the circle, because that's a really interesting reading. My initial way to square the circle is the confessional Christian understanding of Lucifer is what you're describing. And so within confessional Christianity, Lucifer might be the figure of that, like that kind of cracks things. If you read in the way I'm reading, which I think is a non-confessional kind of radical theological way of reading, then I think reading the Lucifer as a superego conjunction to enjoy works. So I don't want to say both and. Actually, I think it would be really good to have a discussion on that one time, and to give the two things. But I actually wonder if it's where one is positioned in relation to it. Because the evangelical reading of Lucifer is actually, as you say, this rebel without a cause, this one who rejects kind of the deterministic position that they're put in, the one who embraces a form of freedom and is whatever. But in the radical tradition, that's Christ. So for me, you don't, like, Christ is the figure. And there's a guy, Kester Broom, he wrote a really good book many years ago, and it's the best reading of the prodigal son that I've ever heard. And so the prodigal son is often used as the story of, we go out, we do bad, God welcomes us back in with open arms, right? And is always there to forgive us. And you've got the Rembrandt painting and all of that. But Bruin's argument is that if you imagine when Jesus told the story of the prodigal son, he wasn't telling it in a way of going, oh, this is something to emulate. He was actually telling it as, this is precisely what I'm not going to do. So you suddenly read Christ as the anti-prodigal. So you think about Jesus, same thing, comes down from heaven, the plenitude comes into the earth, just like the prodigal leaves the plenitude of the Father's house and enters the world. The son gets into lots of trouble, finally eating from a trough. Christ eventually is tried and is going to be executed. And at this moment, the stories diverge. The prodigal son goes, you know what, I'll go back and I'll apologize and I'll repent, and maybe I'll get a wee job at my father's house. He goes back. He doesn't even have to apologize. Before he can, the father welcomes him, puts his arms around him. Whereas Christ, the very moment that he could cry out to God and say, come rescue me, and it says the angels would take him off the cross and bring him to heaven, instead he goes, fuck you, God, why have you forsaken me? He does the anti-prodigal move. Then the temple curtain rips and the absolute has to come into the community, or the communion of believers. I want to call it the social bond, the communion of believers. So I think you can get all of that through Christ. Anyway, yeah.
That's really okay. That's really cool and interesting. I mean, Nance, what are you thinking? What, any questions or
Nance,
follow-ups?
have I convinced you to like Kierkegaard a bit more? There's a couple of times I felt I was actually winning you over.
I mean, I think if I take a Levinasian reading of Kierkegaard, I love Kierkegaard. But the thing is, like, that's already, I think, doing a disservice, because for me it is replacing God with just infinity, and it's like, okay, so we need something above the ethical or the symbolic, which could be religion or could be God, and I prefer this of, like, no, it's just the infinity of the other, and even of myself. But Kierkegaard is very compelling. I think he emphasizes loss as opposed to lack. And I think, Like initially I was talking to Mikey, like, I mean, it isn't the night of faith. Hasn't he been kind of interpolated by the superego where it is lacking the lack itself? Like, oh, give it up, and don't just resign yourself to giving it up, but truly give it up, and it'll doubly replaced, and it'll come back to you in its plenitude. To me, I see that as this kind of superegoic movement as well. But I love Kierkegaard. I really do, because I genuinely think taking this leap, having fanatical faith in what Levinas calls the ethical, I think that is the proper way to be attuned. It really does come down to the signifier. Like, God makes me nervous. The word God makes me feel a certain kind of way.
Yes. Yeah. No, that makes total sense. The thing that you mentioned, Mikey, when he mentions about the weaning process, that for me is an implicit nod to lack, not loss. But you're absolutely right. Like, I think Kierkegaard is all about loss, but there's these elements where I go, oh, like he is hitting the ontological lack. But then when he kind of describes it, it feels more like loss. But there's this lack that's in there. And then on the God thing, I just want to say, I wonder your thoughts on this. I have to figure this, because I'm kind of like, I use the word God, like our God is a part of my project, but I understand the complexity around that signifier. So yeah, I'm hearing you, and I don't know what, I'm in that tension with that signifier.
Well, it names the thing that can't be named, right? I mean, I prefer the Jewish prohibition on using God's name. I do think we must come up with a different word, maybe not a better word, but yeah, a different word.
But what do you think about, because I think the reason why I've held on to it is because I think the idea of a divided God, an alienated God, is really radical. And I guess my issue is this, is I think the death of God, and by the death of God, I primarily mean the self-alienation of God, and that kind of reading, is the privileged name for contradiction. So in mathematics, Gödel's incompleteness theorem, in biology, evolutionary theory, in psychology, the unconscious, in politics, democracy, the non-at-oneness of the social body with itself. There's different names. And so every discipline, I think, when it comes to maturity, the mark of the maturity of the discipline is when it encounters this intractable contradiction. We have particle duality in physics, et cetera, et cetera. But for me, the privileged name for all of that, and maybe I'm very Tilikian in this, but is God. So I use God to say God is the name, but then I'm very much saying God is the name for the absolute contradiction woven into the heart of everything. That, as I say, incompleteness theorem, we have particle duality, democracy, the unconscious, all different flavors of Christ crucified.
Yeah. I mean, I like, or in the past, not so much anymore, but in the past, I thought I was some kind of Buddhist, and I was like, oh, Maya is this kind of excellent word to just, instead of saying God, replace it with illusion, or replace it with this cosmic roadblock or kind of incommensurability. But no, I think it's a problem. I do think it is a problem, because there is this moment where you reach where just nothing works. But God functionally has worked.
Yeah. And is it because, so if you take the definition of God, right, some of the definitions of God, say God is the uncreated creator, for example, and you go, well, if lack itself is the wellspring of everything, then lack kind of fits with the definition of God. So, I mean, I haven't played with this too much, but I kind of do go, like, sometimes when you take the definitions of God, they apply to lack, I think, so yeah, so I well, here's, but I'll tell you the truth here, full transparency, but like, for me, I'm interested in a reformation. And for me, a reformation is liberal Christians are very good at going, like, they don't like words like sin or or crucifixion, and they're always trying to change signifiers. But for me, a reformation is when you keep the same signifiers, but you reinscribe different meaning into them.
Requilt them.
Interesting. What's that, sorry?
Requilt them.
Yeah, exactly. So weirdly, what because when you actually look at Christianity, the meaning, what people mean by things like, redemption or atonement over the centuries is radically different, but they're unified not by signification, but by the signifier. And of course, that's a key in Lacanianism, is what unifies, what's interesting is the signifier, and the signified changes. So for me, the next Reformation, and this is what I've dedicated my life to, is to reinscribe the signifiers with new signification, is not to get rid of the signifiers. But so I think that a Reformation is possible. For me, Hegel, there should have been a Hegelian Reformation. It never happened. Even Karl Barth said it. He said, like, why was Barth not the new Thomas Aquinas? He should have been. There's something weird there. So for me, Hegel is the next Reformation, is the next Thomas Aquinas. It just hasn't happened yet. It nearly happened in 1960. In fact, I've got on my wall the Time magazine article, "Is God Dead?" from the 1960s, when people were actually trying to make liturgies out of this, kind of almost like make a liturgy out of this, but it hasn't happened. But I believe it's possible, and I suppose that's why I hold on to the signifiers. But it is not the signification. I want a Hegelian, Lacanian signification transformation.
Okay, so just a couple questions in closing, and then we'll at some point we got to have another conversation. This has been fantastic. The one thing, kind of to quilt what was going on in Fear and Trembling, I think it would help. There was this other book attached to it called Repetition. What do you think are the takeaways from that text, and how do you think they apply to Fear and Trembling?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Publishes it the same day. And for background for everyone who's listening, the Repetition is written by this guy, Constantine Constantinius, if I'm saying that right. And it is basically, it's really interesting because Fear and Trembling is this book that is all about absolute renunciation and a return. So the double movement, you give something up and somehow you believe it will return. Repetition is like a parody where he almost goes, Kierkegaard says, well, imagine somebody reads Fear and Trembling and they think, I can make this into a technology. I can control this. I think Kierkegaard once said, but I can't find it. I think he once said that having somebody who successful in love, who gives a lecture on how to be successful in love, is like somebody who fell off a cliff and happened to fall in such a way that they survived, and now they give lectures on how to survive falling off a cliff, right? Which is brilliant. And I think that's when I hear people on crypto, that's what I think is like people got lucky. Some people got lucky in crypto, and then they start giving seminars about how to be a brilliant crypto investor. Go like, you just got damn lucky. It's like, don't start giving lectures. So for me, repetition is like that. Kierkegaard's saying, if you read this book and think, oh, I can create a technology out of it, you're sadly mistaken. And so Constantine Constantinius is a guy who tries to enact repetition. And so one of the things he does is he went to Berlin once and had a really good time, which I think you can have a really good time in Berlin, but and not in that way. I don't think he went to the theater, but so he tries to repeat it. He went, saw a great theatrical performance. There was, I think, a blind harpist or something. And so he goes back to Berlin, stays at the same place, goes to the same coffee shops, gets the same seat, goes to the same show. And yet the repetition doesn't work. There's no internal dimension to it. It's hollow. It doesn't work. And then he also, there's a man who's in love, very much like Kierkegaard, where he goes like, oh, I can't consummate the love because it will become normal. It'll become boring. He wants to almost keep the love special by not being with the woman. And so he pushes her away. And this author, Constantine Constantinius, tries to concoct a way for a repetition to happen. And basically, it's a book of failures of repetition. And not completely, because the young lover at the end, and this is really interesting because Fear and Trembling is so much about you give up something and you get the same thing back. And I reject that. What I think is about you give up object putia and you get object. In other words, it's almost like the psychoanalytic thing is you go into psychoanalysis, maybe if you're depressed or melancholic because you've lost the object, you can't desire, or your desire is fixated. And through the cure, you're able to desire again. You're able to find new meaning and purpose, right? So that's how I read, Fear and Trembling. But in repetition, the young man, he gives up the woman, he lets her go. He's distraught because he so desires her, but he just wants to keep the purity of the love. Then she goes and gets married to somebody else. So the repetition can't happen. He can't get her back. Just like Regine Olsen got married and he can't have her back, right? So what does the young man get? Well, he becomes a poet and he gets his freedom. So what the author seems to be saying, or Kierkegaard seems to be saying, is this isn't the night of faith because he didn't get Regine Olsen back. He's not the knight of faith, but it's close to. It is a type of repetition. He loses the object of his absolute love, but he becomes a poet and he gets a certain freedom in his life. And of course, you can't help but hearing that in Kierkegaard, where he became a great kind of prose writer, a great poet of sorts. He never got Regine Olsen back, but there was a repetition. So in some respects, I read repetition as a secularization of Fear and Trembling and a way of kind of saying there is a type of repetition that doesn't mean you have to be like Abraham. So there you go.
How do you think that Kierkegaardian concept of repetition relates to the Freudian Lacanian concept of repetition, or repetition of the drive? You think there's a lot there, or are they just two separate things?
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot. Well, so the Freudian repetition is, so Kierkegaard wants to repeat in a way that is freeing and transformative. So the way I read it is that Kierkegaard understands repetition in the Freudian way, always before Freud, that there's a repetition of like melancholia, just not being able to get over the lost object. And if he's perverse, although I don't think he had perverse sexual acts or whatever, but he's theatrically performing this loss. So there's some repetition in Kierkegaard, but he's so smart, but he sees that there's a different type of repetition that's possible. Maybe it's a Deleuzean repetition, it's a repetition of some which is free and different. And that's one way. There's a few ways of reading Kierkegaard, a few keys, but that's one key. As you go in, is what Kierkegaard trying to do is say that there's a repetition of the Knight of Infinite Resignation, who becomes so in love with the resignation, he becomes just so depressed, so detached, so fixated. And then can he, instead of, because he talks about recollection, the whole point of repetition is he basically contrasts it with recollection of always thinking about the past. And that's kind of the Freudian repetition, is you're always repeating the past, always repeating the past, being really sad, repeating the past. And Kierkegaard says there is something else. The Knight of Faith repeats forward. And I think what Kierkegaard is saying is I never could become the Knight of Faith. I think it's very, very sad, because I think Kierkegaard's always going like, I want to be the Knight of Faith. I want to repeat forward, but I'm just caught in this loop of always repeating the past.
I mean, okay, so looking back, do you think there is a way to do a kind of atheist Lacanian interpretation of Fear and Trembling, even though Kierkegaard wouldn't like it, where we say, look, and to broaden it out with the three spheres of life and then the three registers. So the aesthete is somebody locked in the imaginary. They're self-centered, they're egotistical, it's the enjoyment of their ego, etc. That doesn't work. You make the existential dialectical leap into the symbolic, which is the ethical. So now you have a symbolic identity. You're trying to live up to your interpolation. You're trying to meet the demand of the other, which is fulfill what your duties are as a citizen, etc. That's not enough in life. What you end up having to do is make a jump into the real or the religious, which in the Lacanian sense would be an ethics of desire or an ethics of drive, where whatever this thing is that you have this compulsive, passionate attachment to. And Lacan said, even though like jouissance is self-destructive, it's the thing that gives life meaning, above and beyond symbolic meaning. Is there a way to read Kierkegaard in terms of the ethics of desire / ethics of drive, however you want to think about it, whereas that's the religious and that's what's to be aspired to?
You 100%, you said it perfectly. And that's I weirdly, that's why I'm committed to a religious project because I think that the otherwise than being, the commitment to an ethics of the real, to a drive kind of related, is like that's the work. Now, secretly, there's another reason why I do what I do, which is potentially, I'm trying to self-cure as well. All of our work is self-cure, so like I need a divided God because, for whatever reason. But getting aside from that, the autobiographical, I see what Kierkegaard says by the religious stage as exactly that. And by the way, you can do the same reading with Pascal. Pascal has three orders: the order of the body, the order of the mind, and the order of the heart. The order of the body is basically the imaginary and the aesthetic, where it's about bodily pleasure, it's about getting enjoyment and being, and like the paradigmatic example is the celebrity who gets what they want, and divertisement is the symptom. Then there's the order of the mind, which is the order of the rational, which is the order of the symbolic, and the scholar, right? And then there is the order of the heart, and that the order of the heart is the real. So I think there's a real continuity between Pascal, Kierkegaard, and Lacan.
I love it. Okay, so last thing. All right, guys. I guess I'll go first in this because I'm going to ask this to all three of us. God comes to you and says you have to sacrifice your son or sacrifice the most important person in your life. How do you respond to it? I'll say that I would end up having a hysterical response. I would need further information. I would have to question further. And so I don't know if that would immediately disqualify me. Like I just failed because I need more to go on than simply a voice commanding me. And I get it. People could say, well, Abraham had developed a long relationship with this voice, this presence, throughout his life. It wasn't just showed up willy-nilly. Still, all that's okay, fine. Even if I had developed a long commitment with this presence or this present absence, I would still have to question further about what's going on. I think that's what would be my response. Nance, what's yours? And then Peter, you can close us out.
Yeah, I think I would. I don't want to take the easy way out, and I think the easy way out is, well, I have no idea what I would do. Because yeah, I've that question almost doesn't compute.
Well,
it's like,
you
do you
have
mean,
children.
God? What is God? Yeah, and having children, yeah, like just I don't know, imagining that scenario. I don't know, but I also feel like it's an easy way out to say like, well, I would need some type of validation. Because like trying to imagine an encounter with something that did present itself as God to me, I don't know what that would be. Would it be a burning bush? Would it be an internal voice?
An angel of light?
Would it be, yeah, would I be, struck down on the road to Damascus and blinded? I genuinely don't know. I think if somehow something let itself be known to me, that commanded me to do something absurd, I think I would have to do it. I just don't know how I don't know the mechanics and the logistics of all that. But I do think if something presented itself to me that I was convinced was God, I think I would have to carry out its command.
You wouldn't take the satanic rage against the machine option, which is fuck you, I won't do what you tell me?
I mean, I feel like Abraham genuinely believed it was God. Like there was no like, let's reason with this thing. Let me get some type of like my initial response is, well, I need external validation.
Are you the devil? Is this a trick?
Right. So I mean, I think now, and here's the deal. I think that type of certainty is dangerous. I think it leads to very dangerous things, not just, psychotic things, but I think being certain of anything can lead a person astray. So I would, if I was made certain by the appearance of something, I think I would follow its instructions, but I also think it would be very wrong.
Yeah, because in the Bible, there's a few different. So, well, is it my turn? Well,
Yeah,
I
you're
go
up.
say, yeah. So my way of thinking about this is, so in the Bible, there's a few different archetypes. So is it Abraham who also wrestles, who God says, I'm going to destroy a city, and Abraham says, don't? So you do have neurotics in the Bible that are equally faithful. So for me, everybody has this experience. So this is where I'm Kierkegaard. So your hypothetical is like, all of us have it. And your response is depending on whether you're neurotic, perverse, psychotic, or autistic. And if you're neurotic, you're never going to have a psychotic response to that voice. So the neurotic is the one who will say, I don't know, and I'll wrestle with you, and I'll be like Jacob, and I'll fight you, and I'll wrestle, and you can be faithful as a neurotic. If you're psychotic, you literally, God does appear, and God does say it. And then what do you do with that? Yeah, I don't know. So I'm saying basically that as a Kierkegaardian, potentially, metaphorically, all of us have to respond and tarry with the real. And depending on whether I'm going to throw autism in there because I do think it's a structure, but I'm tentative about that. But I
Leon
think it
Brenner
is.
has done a lot of great work on making that a fourth structure.
Yeah. I've read his book. I've listened to a lot of seminars, and I know a lot of Watts' friends, and I'm just like, I think it's a structure. Bruce Fink thinks it's a structure, and I think it's a structure. So I think depending on which one you are, will give an answer to that, and that's my way of saying I don't know. I don't want to say which one I want to do, because then you'll know whether I'm neurotic, perverse, psychotic, or autistic. And I don't know if I want to say which one I am.
I'll just own it. I'm neurotic, all too neurotic.
Yeah, well, that's the easy one to admit, because that's
Right.
it's the least crazy.
It's but see, this is what's great about this book. This is why I'll tell any atheist I know who loves philosophy, no, you gotta read Kierkegaard. Look at who he influenced: Sartre and Heidegger, and he's influenced Slavoj. He influences he's just one of these thinkers that is so singular and so original that reckoning with his thought, even if you end up wildly disagreeing with him, makes you so much better as a thinker.
It's just so hard to wrestle with. I genuinely think this will be one of the better conversations about that book that's online. I went looking for good conversations about Fear and Trembling, and I actually didn't. I found one or two that were okay. That's about it. Sorry, Siri's talking to me. One or two that because it's very hard. It's very hard to kind of tease out the depth of it, but that's what's so brilliant. There's so much depth. There's, as I say, you can read it as a critique of Hegel. You can read it as a reflection on faith. You can read it as an existential reflection on what it is to be a subject. You can read it as reflections on melancholia and what the cure to melancholia looks like. That's just four different and it's all in Fear and Trembling.
Absolutely.
And then you've got to wrestle with the fact of where is Kierkegaard in it, and the pseudonymous writer, and it's brilliant. Yeah.
Well, I hope we did some justice to this incredible book and one of my favorite philosophers of all time. I definitely want to do more with Kierkegaard in the future. But Peter, this has been so fantastic. Hope you come back down the road and we can have another conversation about this type of stuff.
Love
I
what you
definitely
guys
want to
do. Love it. Yeah.
want to pick your brain more on, ethics of desire and superego and Crowley and that whole rabbit hole we could go down. So thank you again. Everybody check out Peter's work on YouTube and online, and he's just one of the most important figures in the online theory space working today. So fantastic. Look forward to talking to you next time. Later.